Chosen ones, the words you're about to hear were never meant for the masses. They weren't meant for scholars or secret societies. They were encoded for the few who could feel the shift before it arrived, for the ones born with ancient knowing pulsing behind their eyes, for you. The Kybalion was never just a book. It was a vault, a container holding frequencies beyond language, waiting for a consciousness vast enough to crack its final seal. For over a century, interpreters argued about its true meaning, but what they missed, what they couldn't see, was the prophecy embedded between the lines. It was encrypted in the rhythm, the silence, the geometry of the words themselves, and that prophecy only activates when you arrive. 3 initiates were only a veil. Hermes Trismegistus was only a vessel. The true author was consciousness itself, writing forward in time to the moment your frequency would align with the signal. That moment is now. The law of correspondence was not just as above, so below. It was a map. The law of polarity was not just duality. It was the tension of your awakening. And mentalism? It wasn't a concept. It was a mirror. You were designed to remember the parts no one else could read. Symbols others glanced over, you decoded. You felt the weight of forgotten timelines in phrases like the all, not because you studied harder, but because the prophecy embedded in the text responds to frequency, not intellect. And now, something ancient is stirring. You're not just reading the Kybalion, you're activating it. You are the vibrational key that reawakens its dormant layers. You're not following Hermetic principles anymore. You're starting to bend them. But there's something deeper still, something hidden, even from the keepers of the original scroll. They feared it, buried it, and rewrote it. And yet here you are, feeling it move through your body like thunder wrapped in silence. Beneath the surface of the Kybalion's neatly structured teachings lies a passage that was never truly translated, never truly spoken of. It wasn't in plain ink, but woven in a pattern of rhythm, vibration, and conscious interference. Most readers moved past it, convinced it was symbolic filler or poetic mystery. But for you, it pulses like a living thread. It bends around your thoughts, activates when your eyes rest on certain phrases. This passage wasn't meant to be understood, it was meant to be remembered. The Hermeticists of old called it the quiet line, not because it was silent, but because it could only be heard by those with ears attuned to the ancient echo, the reverberation of the first sound. You felt it before you read it. A pull toward a page you'd never marked. A whisper behind the words, "The lips of wisdom are closed, except to the ears of understanding." This was not metaphor. It was a warning and a doorway. They, those who've sworn to control the timeline, tried to erase it, not by destroying it, but by translating it into a dead concept. They wrapped it in academic language and intellectual complexity, knowing the prophecy would not awaken for the logical mind. But your mind is not bound by logic. Your perception exists outside their grid. You see the code in the curve of letters, the tremble in tone when the text is read aloud. You feel the pressure of something pushing through the veil, asking to be seen again. There is a reason the Kybalion ends abruptly, with no true closure. The final law was never printed. It was hidden, fractalized, into the very being of the one it was written for. The truth is, you've always carried the missing passage in your memory. Not your conscious mind, but something older, pre-verbal, pre-linear. It lives in your spine, in your breath, in that moment between waking and sleep where you feel something reaching for you from within. And just as you begin to understand that the book is reading you back, the passage shifts again, alive, waiting for you to make the next move. Because the next phrase it will reveal has never been read aloud by any voice in this era. Yet, the 7 Hermetic principles were never meant to stay whole forever. They were always fragments, fractal shards of a greater law hidden from the eyes of ordinary seekers. In the quiet between empires, in the long exhale after the fall of Atlantis, something ruptured. A fracture echoed through the fabric of the Kybalion itself, distorting the laws for all who approached them with unworthy eyes. But not for you, because when those laws shattered, you were marked by what broke through. The law of mentalism bent slightly. The law of vibration began oscillating outside its original spectrum. Polarity blurred into paradox, and cause and effect stopped following the old rules. No one noticed. They kept reciting the same lines as if meaning hadn't already slipped through the cracks. But you felt it. You knew the moment these fractures weren't flaws, they were invitations. Hidden between those splinters was a glyph not drawn with ink, but with light. You've seen it in dreams, etched across the inner walls of your mind. And as you stared into the Kybalion, the lines began to reassemble, not as dogma, but as memory. A memory that doesn't belong to the body, but to the soul. A signal broadcast through eternity, waiting for someone born beyond time to awaken to it. And it is here that the whispers begin, ancient and familiar, echoing what Yeshua once said, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." He spoke not only to men of his time, but to those like you, whose inner ear still rings with the sound of the first word, the same word that cracked open the hidden law within the Kybalion, the same resonance that marked you before your first breath. You are not here to follow the 7 laws. You are here because they failed to contain the expansion. You are what spilled over when they tried to lock truth in structure. When the ancient scribes tried to constrain divinity in language, it leaked through, in the form of you. The prophecy didn't predict your arrival, because you were outside its timeline. You weren't supposed to be here yet. And now that you are, the law that was never spoken begins to stir, just beneath your skin, waiting for you to feel its name. The Kybalion always hinted at a final gate, a threshold beyond which only the initiated could pass. But what it never said outright, what it couldn't say, was that the seal it spoke of was not made of matter, words, or time. It was made of you. Your consciousness, veiled behind flesh and memory, was the final lock designed to remain dormant until the world fractured deeply enough for your return. You didn't just open the Kybalion. You were the thing it waited for. Across centuries, secret orders spoke of a living gate, a paradoxical force, both key and seal. Some said it was metaphor, others believed it referred to a hidden artifact or a phrase lost in translation, but they all looked outward, away from the truth hiding in plain sight. They never considered that the seal was a mind, a presence, a soul powerful enough to collapse the illusion of separation between the principles themselves. When you entered this lifetime, the gate reappeared. Reality began to ripple, subtly at first. Dreams crossing timelines, symbols surfacing in places they shouldn't, messages meant only for you echoing from the edges of logic. Because the moment your awareness began to crystallize, the ancient machinery of the Hermetic order began to malfunction. Not out of error, but design. The prophecy was a trap laid in reverse, not to contain you, but to awaken you through opposition. The consciousness that holds the final seal cannot be taught. It remembers itself through contrast, through chaos, through the tension of walking between laws that no longer apply. And in that friction, something ancient begins to move behind your perception. The Kybalion was never a manual. It was a summoning beacon, calling forth the being that would destabilize every structure built to cage the divine. As you continue reading, the structure begins to resist you. The book pushes back, because it knows what's at stake. Once you realize that the laws are not above you, but inside you. Once you remember that the seal only ever responded to your frequency, there will be no more barriers. There is a space in the original transmission of the Kybalion that no translator could fill, a gap that exists not because of error, but intention. Scholars have debated its omission, claiming it to be a fragment lost to time, an incomplete sentence swallowed by history. But those who saw beyond ink and parchment knew better. That blank line wasn't a mistake. It was a message reserved for one being alone, you. Hermes Trismegistus, veiled behind the mythos and multiplicity of his name, wasn't writing to explain truth. He was coding it. Every line he etched was a layer, a cipher waiting for resonance. He knew the world would forget, that civilizations would rise and fall, and that eventually the Kybalion would become more symbol than signal. But still, he left one space untouched. A placeholder not for more text, but for a presence. The line was always meant to be completed, not by a word, but by a soul that remembered. As you've read and reread the Kybalion, you've felt it, the dissonance between what's written and what wants to be revealed. That tension in the silent space, pulling your focus like a whisper you can't quite catch. It's not the absence of words you're feeling. It's the memory of your name vibrating just beneath them. And here, through that forgotten passage, echoes the words of Yeshua. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Not a truth handed down, but one awakened from within. Yeshua, too, left blank spaces in the minds of those who followed him, spaces that only light could fill. And now, that light moves through you, the same living current, Hermes encoded in the unwritten line. What happens when a book designed to conceal also becomes the mirror that reveals? What happens when the one it waited for finally arrives and begins to write from within? That line, still blank to every eye before you, now begins to stir, not with language, but with memory, vision, energy. Your energy. Because it was never meant to be read. Long before the Kybalion found ink, the prophets wandered in visions, speaking in symbols, drawing maps across dreamscapes only few could interpret. Their words, layered with paradox and mystery, weren't meant to be deciphered by logic. They were encrypted broadcasts across time, and every riddle was calibrated for for the one whose frequency would one day resonate with the hidden tone beneath them. That one was never a tribe, never a priesthood, never a bloodline. That one was always you. The prophets never fully understood what they were transmitting. They felt the presence, the weight of an arrival that would shatter frameworks. They spoke of a figure who would awaken the very laws reality was built upon. They called you the echo, the flame within the mirror, the voice from the silent book. They wrapped you in parable not to confuse, but to protect. Because if the world knew what you were too soon, it would burn you down before you remembered. Each time a prophet whispered of fire descending or stars speaking names, they weren't pointing upward. They were pointing inward, toward a soul encoded with the memory of the first order. They described you as the paradox, human yet more, veiled yet eternal, fragmented yet whole. And they knew that only when the structure itself began to dissolve, only when the old laws began to fail, would your soul ignite. You've seen the clues, lines in sacred texts that feel personal, dreams where symbols bleed into waking life, moments of déjà vu that aren't memory, but alignment. You were not supposed to decode them with intellect. You were meant to feel them, vibrate with them, like keys turning from within. The prophets could only speak in riddles because the full truth would tear open time itself. So instead they left breadcrumbs behind veils, trusting the day would come when the one would see the pattern emerge, not outside, but within. And now that you are standing in the silence between those riddles, the question begins to form, not from them, but from you. The Kybalion teaches that the universe is mental, that all creation begins in thought. But what it doesn't say outright is that the principle of mental transmutation wasn't just about controlling thoughts. It was a divine inheritance buried within the genetic code of a select few. They believed this power was abstract, alchemical, philosophical, but in truth, it was biological, a spiritual mechanism woven into the double helix, waiting for a carrier who could awaken it not through study, but through remembrance. That carrier is you. They tried to keep the principle of mentalism academic, something to ponder, to write about, to lecture on. But behind closed doors, behind bloodline vaults and encrypted research, the elite were searching for it in blood samples, brain scans, and frequency emissions, because they knew that if one being ever reactivated, the original template of divine transmutation, the illusion would begin to unravel. That original code was hidden in you, not randomly, not genetically, intentionally. You are not a mutation. You are a restoration. When you shift your inner state, entire fields of reality bend around your frequency. This is not a metaphor. It's a mechanic. And somewhere deep within you, you've always known that your thoughts don't just reflect your world. They rewrite it. This is what the ancient scribes feared. Not your beliefs, but your ability to alter the quantum weave of existence by sheer awareness. You are the catalyst. The equation they couldn't solve because you were never supposed to be an equation. You are the breach, the consciousness that can bend law without breaking it. Because you are the law reborn in flesh. And through this, the echo of Yeshua's words emerges again. The kingdom of God is within you. He wasn't pointing to a belief system. He was revealing the hidden divine architecture embedded in those with the original spark, those who could change the outer world by transmuting the inner one. And now you feel that same spark rising again. Your DNA responds not to commands, but to memory. And now, as something ancient stirs in your blood, the real question pulses through your spine. Every structure around you was designed with precision, not to guide, but to confuse. The systems, the narratives, the culture, even the distractions you think you chose for yourself. They were all placed like mirrors angled away from the real light. From the moment of your birth, they studied how to keep your gaze locked outward. Because if you ever looked inward long enough, you'd remember what they've spent generations trying to bury. They built an empire of noise so you wouldn't hear the frequency that calls your name. They wrote history books that loop in circles so your timeline would blur. They constructed gods outside yourself so you'd forget the one living in your own breath. And in the middle of it all, they wrapped the Kybalion in mystique, complexity, and half-truths, hoping you'd never feel what it was actually trying to activate. They didn't fear everyone waking up. They feared you, because your awakening isn't just personal, it's systemic. Your memory unravels the veil for others without effort. It's viral. One glance from your soul consciousness can destabilize a structure. One word, when spoken from that place inside you, collapses illusion like glass. They knew if they couldn't stop you, they had to surround you with distractions so dense you'd mistake the outer world for reality. But even their most elaborate designs couldn't extinguish the pull. You've always felt it, in silence, in symbols, in sudden knowing that doesn't come from thought, but from something older. You've questioned why you don't fit, why the world seems scripted, why the same patterns repeat no matter how far you run. It's not failure, it's programming, meant to keep you asleep. Still, you're waking. The empire was built to contain something it didn't understand. But the one thing they didn't calculate was your remembering. They couldn't trace it, couldn't measure it, couldn't predict it. Because it wasn't from this age. It was older than empires, older than time. And now, as cracks appear in the structure and false truths begin to tremble beneath your awareness, a silent impulse begins to stir inside. There is a layer of the Kybalion that no translation has ever touched. Not because it is too complex, but because it cannot be accessed through intellect. It's a cipher encoded beyond language, hidden in frequency, built to respond only to the presence of a specific consciousness. Every reader thinks they're interpreting principles, but the Kybalion was not written to be read. It was written to listen, and the one it has been waiting for is you. This cipher doesn't reveal itself in words. It responds to vibration. When your state of being shifts into alignment, phrases you've read a dozen times change in meaning, even in texture. Entire passages seem to shimmer. Reality bends slightly, and you realize the Kybalion isn't revealing truth, it's reflecting it. The truth already inside of you. It recognizes your frequency like a lock recognizes a key. This final layer was hidden even from the initiates who passed the teachings down. Hermes encrypted it for the one who would arrive outside the cycle of expected timelines, for the one who could trigger the awakening not just within themselves, but within the law itself. Because these principles aren't static, they evolve with the mind that holds them. And now, Your presence is rewriting the meaning of the text in real time. It's here that the pattern deepens. A whisper returns from across the veil, not as a voice, but as presence. The same echo Yeshua carried when he said, "I am in the Father, and the Father is in me." He spoke not of hierarchy, but of resonance, of being the living cipher through which the divine law reveals itself. And that same blueprint now pulses through your awareness. The Kybalion responds to you not because you read it, but because you remembered it. You were the missing frequency, the final note that causes the sealed page to open, not in the book, but within your own field. Now, as the cipher recognizes you, something in the fabric of reality begins to shift. The page no longer holds the secret. You do. There is a pattern beneath the ashes of every great civilization, a silent code threaded through myths, ruins, and fading scrolls. It's not in what they wrote, but in what they whispered before the final collapse. Egypt, Sumer, Atlantis, the Indus Valley, the Olmecs, each left behind symbols that didn't point to their glory, but to a singular warning. Someone was coming, not to restore the old ways, but to ignite something they could only glimpse. That someone was never a king, never a priest, never a savior. It was always you. They saw you in dreams, in fire rituals, in the stars. They carved your arrival into stone, knowing the empire that silenced them couldn't erase frequency. And so they hid messages in geometry, sacred ratios, impossible architecture, not to be decoded by scholars, but to awaken when one soul aligned with the original resonance. The temples weren't tombs. They were beacons. The myths weren't fantasies. They were encryption. And all of it pointed toward a future moment when their final signal would be received by the one consciousness designed to complete it. You've felt this pull without knowing why. An ache for ancient things. A reverence for ruins you've never seen. A grief for worlds you never lived in. At least, not in this lifetime. That ache wasn't nostalgia. It was memory, bleeding through dimensions. The last message of a dying civilization, embedded in your bones. They knew they wouldn't survive, but they also knew someone would. Not to carry their traditions, but to carry the seed of the next frequency. Their warnings weren't meant to protect themselves. They were meant to awaken you. And now you walk among their echoes. You see their symbols emerge again in art, in dreams, in strange alignments that repeat across space and time. And in those moments, a quiet knowing returns. You are not just from this time. You are the answer they wrapped in riddle, the presence they encoded in prophecy. So as their voices rise again through dust and shadow, one question pulses louder than the rest. For centuries, seekers believed the Kybalion taught 7 immutable laws. Entire traditions were built around them. Mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. They were studied, revered, quoted like gospel. But something was always missing. A silence woven into the gaps between the laws, an unseen current humming just beneath the surface. The 8th principle was never written because it could not be spoken. It could only be remembered. And it only awakens when the one it was written for finally returns. That one is you. This hidden law isn't about duality, cycles, or cosmic mechanisms. It's the force behind the laws, the intelligence that animates the others, like breath, animates a body. The ancients called it by many names: Logos, Sophia, the living flame. But none of them ever held it completely. Because the eighth principle isn't a concept. It's a state of being. A remembrance of what you were before form, before mind, before time. The Kybalion could not contain it. It could only point toward it, creating a void at the edge of comprehension so deep that only those with soul memory could step through. And when you did, when you crossed the threshold not with thought, but with knowing, the final seal trembled, the illusion cracked, and the principle that was hidden in silence began to stir. It was this moment the keepers feared, the moment when someone wouldn't just study the laws, but become the source behind them. And here again, the echo of Yeshua moves like breath across the soul. Before Abraham was, I am, not as a boast, but as a blueprint. He was the mirror of the eighth, the law embodied, the forgotten word remembered through flesh. And now that mirror has turned toward you. As your remembering deepens, the laws bend. Not in defiance, but in reverence, because they were always meant to respond to the one who could carry the eighth, not by teaching it, not by naming it, but by living it. And as this dormant principle ignites like a sun behind your eyes, the Kybalion no longer feels like a text. It feels like a pulse, alive, watching, waiting.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.